Murder in 317, a murderous adventure of a short story. Chapter 1, Echoes from 317. Detective Aiden Shaw sat in his cramped apartment above Wong's kitchen, listening to the muffled sounds of Chinatown drifting through the thin walls. The savory smell of dumplings and sesame oil snuck through the cracks in the floorboards, mixing with the stale scent of coffee that clung to his furniture. Life after hours was quiet here, mostly anyway. That night, however, a strange noise caught his attention. Beside him, his retired canine partner, a German shepherd named Max, lifted his head from his paws, ears pricked toward the door. Aiden scratched behind Max's ears, noting the dog's tense posture. "What is it, buddy?" he murmured as Max's gaze remained fixed on the hallway outside. The noise had come from the apartment across the hall, 317. Aiden knew the tenant well. Detective Lou Miller, 20 years his senior, and once his begrudging mentor and rival on the police force. Lou had spent years building his reputation, working long hours and solving cases that Aiden had only heard about from other cops. But despite Lou's legendary status, they'd never quite gotten along. Lou was the old guard, set in his ways and often dismissive of Aiden's fresh approach to detective work. They'd been in constant competition before Lou's retirement a few months back. The building was notorious for having a low rent, something rare to find in New York City, of all places, as long as you don't mind living above the Chinese restaurant down on the first floor. Food-wise, it had its advantages. But rent this low attracted a certain kind of renter. Aiden had been lucky enough that Lou had told him when his now apartment 318 had become available. And even though Aiden and Lou didn't always see eye to eye, Lou had been willing to occasionally watch Max on days when Aiden had been too wrapped up in cases to make it home. And Max, with his unending canine loyalty, had formed an odd bond with the older detective. Aiden couldn't deny it had been convenient, and he'd even appreciated Lou's help, though he'd never admit it outright. The noises from 317 grew louder, faint, shuffling. Then, a soft thud. Aiden frowned, and so did Max, who rose to his feet, his eyes sharp and alert. Despite himself, Aiden felt his pulse quicken. His mind raced with possibilities, each one carrying a whiff of danger. But curiosity won out over caution. Grabbing his keys and slipping on his boots, Aiden gave Max a signal to stay and stepped into the dimly lit hallway. He walked quietly, each creak of the wooden floor beneath him loud in the silence. The closer he got to Lou's door, the stronger his sense of foreboding became. He rapped his knuckles on the door, but there was no response. An unsettling silence filled the space, thick and heavy. He knocked again, harder this time. "Lou, you all right in there?" When there was still no answer, Aiden's instincts kicked in. He tried the doorknob, surprised to find it unlocked. Pushing the door open, he was greeted by a darkness that seemed to swallow the room whole. Shadows clung to the corners, draping themselves over the sparse furniture. Aiden flipped the light switch and the room lit up in pale, flickering light. There, sprawled on the floor by the window, was Lou. Aiden's breath caught as he took in the scene. Lou lay motionless, his face obscured in shadow. For a split second, Aiden thought maybe he'd just had one too many and passed out. But as he stepped closer, reality struck with a chilling certainty. Lou wasn't breathing. His skin was pale, his body still. It was then that Aiden noticed Max had slipped out of the apartment and joined him, padding silently to his side. The dog seemed unusually subdued, sniffing the air with a look of quiet concentration. Max had been trained to recognize danger, to sense things that human eyes often missed. Aiden knew that look well. It was the same alertness Max used to display back when they were on active duty together. Aiden knelt beside his former rival's body, spotting bruises on Lou's wrists and a slight smear of blood trailing from his lip. It was clear Lou hadn't gone quietly, whatever had happened to him. "Come on, Max," Aiden whispered as he rose, taking a moment to regain his composure. They exited the apartment, closing the door behind them before Aiden pulled out his phone to report the discovery. Protocol would mean he couldn't be officially involved in the investigation. He was too close to the case, too familiar with the victim. But that didn't mean he'd let it go. Not when Max kept glancing back at 317, as if expecting Lou to walk out any second. The police were quick to arrive, and Aiden found himself standing on the sidewalk outside, shivering slightly as he watched them secure the scene. He didn't know what bothered him more, that Lou was gone, or that someone had seen fit to kill a retired detective with years of experience under his belt. It was as if some old grudge had been laid to rest. A vendetta finally settled in blood. "Aiden!" a voice called, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Captain Garcia, her face set in a stern line. "You know you're off this one. Too close, yeah?" Aiden nodded reluctantly, though every fiber of his being screamed against it. "Yeah, Cap, I understand. Let the team handle it." Her voice softened as she glanced at Max, who sat patiently by Aiden's side. "Take some time, Aiden, and keep Max close. He looks unsettled." As Garcia turned and headed back toward the building, Aiden caught a glimpse of the suspects being questioned nearby. There was Henry, the landlord, his face pale and hands nervously fumbling with his keys. Marta, the elderly crazy cat lady who lived down the hall, watched with a hawkish gaze, her lips pursed tight. Closer to the restaurant's side entrance was Sammy, the musician, watching with barely concealed suspicion. And there was May, the waitress, casting furtive glances toward the alley. A fifth person, someone Aiden hadn't noticed before, lurked in the background, a man with dark, deep-set eyes and an unreadable expression. 5 people, each with their own quirks, each with their own history with Lou. He'd make sure to find out more, one way or another. As they walked back to his apartment, Max let out a low whine, casting a glance over his shoulder at 317. Aiden patted his head, letting out a quiet sigh. The older detective may have been a pain in his side, but Aiden wasn't about to let his killer go free. He owed Lou that much, if not for the rivalry, then for all those times he'd grudgingly looked after Max, a silent guardian, when Aiden himself hadn't been around. And if Lou's killer was somewhere in this building, Aiden knew he'd get to the truth. One way or another, he would make sure that 317's secrets didn't stay hidden for long. Chapter 2. The Last Call. The morning light crept through the window as Aiden sat at his kitchen table staring at his untouched cup of coffee. His mind buzzed with unanswered questions, replaying the scene from the night before. Lou Miller was dead, and Aiden's gut told him it hadn't been an accident. Lou had been sharp enough to spot trouble coming from a mile away. Whatever had happened in 317, it hadn't been a surprise attack. Lou had put up a fight, and that told Aiden one thing. The killer was no stranger. Max sat by Aiden's feet, his head resting on his paws, eyes trained on the door, as if waiting for Lou to return and disrupt their quiet morning with his gruff humor. Aiden absently scratched behind Max's ears, grateful for the familiar presence. Despite Captain Garcia's orders to stay away, Aiden knew he couldn't just let the case go. The official team would be thorough, of course, but Lou had been more than just an old rival. He'd been a part of Aiden's life, someone who understood what it meant to carry the weight of the badge. And Lou had been looking after Max. He'd stepped in when Aiden hadn't been able to. Aiden owed him. As he took a sip of his now lukewarm coffee, a knock echoed through the apartment. Max's ears perked up, and he trotted to the door, sniffing as Aiden opened it to find Captain Garcia standing there, her face set in a hard line. She stepped in without waiting for an invitation, folding her arms as she eyed Aiden with a look he'd seen before. "I told you to stay clear of this one," she said, her voice low and firm. Aiden held her gaze, knowing any defense he offered would fall flat. "I know, but I need to understand what happened. Lou and we may have had our differences, but this is different." Garcia sighed, her expression softening just a bit. "Listen, Aiden, I know what Lou meant to you. Everyone in the precinct knew you two had a complicated relationship." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But we're handling it. Officially." Aiden didn't reply, just shifted his gaze toward Max, who seemed to sense his internal struggle, leaning his weight against Aiden's leg in silent support. "Look," Garcia continued, "I can't officially let you near the case, but I know better than to expect you'll sit back and do nothing. Just be careful. If you dig up anything, come to me first, okay?" Aiden nodded, appreciating the leeway. "Thanks, Cap." With a final warning glance, Garcia left, and Aiden took a deep breath. He knew he had to tread carefully, but he wouldn't sit idle. Later that day, Aiden decided to get back to his routine, hoping a familiar walk with Max might clear his mind. As they made their way down the stairs, the scents of sizzling oil and soy sauce wafted up from Wong's kitchen below. May, the waitress, was busy setting up tables in front of the restaurant. When she spotted Aiden, her face shifted, a mixture of apprehension and forced friendliness. She offered a small wave, but her eyes darted to Max, who stared back with unnerving focus. "Hey, detective," she greeted, her voice a little too cheerful. "Terrible thing. What happened to Mr. Miller? He was a good man? Mostly?" "Mostly?" Aiden asked, catching the hesitance in her tone. She shrugged, glancing back at the door as if to make sure no one was listening. "Look, Mr. Miller was a good tenant, paid his rent on time and all, but he had dealings. People who came and went at odd hours, you know? I'm not saying it means anything, but it wasn't exactly peaceful with him around." Aiden's brow furrowed. Lou had never mentioned anything shady, but May's words planted a seed of doubt. "You ever see anyone specific?" "No one I'd recognize, detective. Just, the type that doesn't like to be noticed, if you get my meaning." "Yeah, I do," Aiden replied, nodding. He left May to her work, though his mind churned with new questions. Had Lou been involved in something beyond the badge? As he and Max continued their walk, they passed by Henry, the building's landlord, who was fussing with the lock on the front door. The wiry man seemed flustered, muttering to himself as he fumbled with his keys. "Aiden, terrible about Lou, isn't it?" Henry said, his voice filled with exaggerated sadness. "Can't believe it. Lou was, well, he was unique." Aiden could sense a tinge of resentment beneath Henry's words. "You two didn't get along?" "Oh, no, nothing like that, just..." He kept to himself. Didn't trust people. Had this knack for looking at you like he knew all your secrets. Unsettling, that was. Henry chuckled nervously. "But you know, that's just Lou." Aiden noted the landlord's discomfort, a subtle nervousness that didn't seem entirely genuine. There was something there, something Henry wasn't saying, but Aiden filed it away for now. As he turned to leave, he noticed Max giving Henry a long, piercing stare. The dog's hackles raised slightly, and a low rumble started in his chest, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Easy, Max," Aiden murmured, tugging gently on the leash. But Max kept his gaze locked on Henry, as if detecting a hidden layer of intent. Good dog," Henry mumbled, offering an uneasy laugh. "Wouldn't hurt a fly, would you?" Aiden didn't respond, instead making a mental note of Max's reaction. The dog had rarely been wrong in all their years together, and Aiden trusted his instincts. As they headed back toward the building's side entrance, they crossed paths with Sammy, the musician who lived one floor down. Sammy was a tall, gaunt man with a mop of messy hair and a guitar slung over his shoulder. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes hinting at a sleepless night. He nodded in acknowledgement, then hesitated as if deciding whether to speak. "You got any idea who did it?" Sammy asked, his voice low. Not yet, Aiden replied, watching him carefully. Sammy shifted on his feet, glancing around before lowering his voice further. Listen, I don't know who to tell, but a couple of nights ago, I saw someone hanging around by Lou's door. Real late, you know. Figured it was just a friend or something, but they didn't look like the friendly type. Why didn't you say anything before? Aiden asked, his tone sharper than intended. Sammy shrugged, a look of shame crossing his face. Didn't think much of it. Looked like Lou could handle himself, you know? And people like me, we're not exactly eager to get involved with cops. Aiden nodded, but his mind was already racing. Lou's life, his possible secrets, the quiet warnings from May and Sammy. It was all beginning to form a shape, jagged and dark. Max, ever watchful, nudged Aiden's leg, his eyes scanning the quiet hallways around them. Aiden couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been left with a puzzle, one that only Lou himself could have solved. The pieces were scattered, but Aiden was determined whoever had taken Lou's life had left threads behind, threads that he and Max would follow through the labyrinthine corridors of their building, and perhaps through the hidden recesses of Lou's secretive life. Chapter 3. Instincts and Odd Behaviors. Days passed, and Lou's death remained a shadow over the building. Aiden found himself struggling to shake off the image of his former rival lying lifeless in apartment 317. Despite the official investigation's progress, Aiden knew he couldn't ignore the nagging instincts urging him to dig deeper. After all, he wasn't just looking out for a fellow cop. He was following a trail of loose threads only he and Max seemed to notice. Max's behavior around the suspects was another thread that pulled at him. The retired police dog had honed instincts, and Aiden trusted his silent cues. Max had seemed on edge around Henry, the landlord, and uncharacteristically wary around Sammy, the musician. It wasn't much, but Aiden had learned over the years that with a little patience, even the smallest lead could crack a case wide open. Today he planned to talk with Marta, the elderly tenant down the hall, and May, the waitress from Wong's Kitchen. Each had known Lou in different ways, and Aiden hoped to tease out the details they hadn't yet shared with the detectives. Aiden knocked on Marta's door first, Max sitting alertly by his side. The door creaked open, and Marta's wrinkled face appeared, her expression softening when she saw Max. "Oh, Detective Shaw, is something wrong?" she asked, her voice a mix of worry and curiosity. "Just wanted to ask a few questions about Lou," Aiden replied, keeping his tone gentle. "You knew him for quite a while, right?" Marta nodded, gesturing for them to enter. Her apartment was small but filled with knickknacks and framed photos of her family. She settled into an old armchair and looked at Aiden thoughtfully. Lou was, well, he was an odd one, always coming and going at strange hours, but he was kind to me. Checked in every now and then. "Not many people in this building care about an old woman like me," she said with a sad smile. "Did you notice anything unusual in the days before he died?" Aiden asked, watching her face closely. She thought for a moment, her eyes narrowing. "You know, I did see him arguing with someone outside his door. It was late at night, maybe a day or two before. Well, before you found him." "Could you see who it was?" Aiden leaned forward, feeling the tension build. Marta shook her head. "No, but they were tall, almost as tall as you. And they had a deep voice, angry. Lou wasn't backing down, though. He was shouting right back." "Thank you, Marta. That's helpful." Aiden made a note to check on any reports of disturbances. But before he could ask more, Max shifted beside him, his nose twitching as he stared intently at Marta's armchair. "Oh, look at him," Marta chuckled, reaching into a nearby drawer. "I think he remembers the treats I keep for him. Lou used to bring him over sometimes, you know. They'd sit here, and Lou would tell me stories about his cases." She pulled out a small biscuit and handed it to Max, who took it gently, but continued to watch her, his brown eyes assessing her every move. Aiden thanked her and left, his mind replaying her words. So Lou had been in an argument, and recently. It wasn't much, but it fit with what Sammy had hinted at. Lou's recent company wasn't exactly the friendly type. As they headed down the stairs, Aiden spotted May, the waitress, slipping out of Wong's kitchen. She froze for a moment when she saw him, then offered a weak smile. "Detective Shaw. Wasn't expecting to see you again so soon," she said, her voice thin. "Just following up," Aiden replied casually. "You mentioned Lou had some unconventional visitors?" She nodded, glancing around nervously. "Yeah. Look, I don't know who they were. Lou wasn't exactly open about his business, you know. But last week I saw him with a guy I'd never seen before. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark clothes. They were speaking quietly, but it looked intense. Did you catch anything they said?" May shook her head, then lowered her voice. "I don't think Lou was as retired as he liked to pretend. There was this edge to him lately, like he was always looking over his shoulder." Aiden took note, a chill creeping over him. The story was starting to come together in fragments. Someone had unsettled Lou enough to put him on high alert. But what kind of trouble had Lou stirred up? The man had been retired, but clearly he hadn't stopped digging where he shouldn't. Max let out a soft growl, his gaze fixed on something behind May. Aiden turned to see Henry, the landlord, lingering at the doorway, watching them with an inscrutable expression. "You two talking about Lou?" Henry asked, his voice slightly too casual. "Yes," Aiden replied, meeting Henry's gaze. "Just trying to make sense of everything." Henry scratched the back of his head, a nervous tic that Aiden hadn't missed before. Sad business. But maybe it's a reminder that sometimes it's best to let things lie. Aiden felt a prick of irritation. "What exactly are you suggesting, Henry?" Henry's face paled and he quickly shook his head. "Nothing. Just that Lou wasn't exactly a saint, you know. He got mixed up in things. Maybe whatever happened was just inevitable." May shot Aiden an uneasy look before slipping back into the restaurant, and Aiden studied Henry closely. There was something Henry wasn't saying, something he was clearly afraid of. But why? After Henry had disappeared down the hallway, Aiden knelt beside Max, scratching his head. "What do you think, Max?" "I think Henry knows more than he's letting on, and maybe so does May." Max gave a soft whine, his nose brushing Aiden's hand, as if confirming his suspicion. They stood in silence for a moment, each of them sensing that there was something darker lurking beneath the surface of Lou's life. Later that evening, Aiden sat in his apartment, trying to piece together the fragments of information. The night was quiet, the hum of the restaurant downstairs lulling him into a focused trance as he reviewed his mental notes. Max lay curled up by his feet, alert and watching him, as if sensing the importance of this investigation. Aiden couldn't shake the feeling that Max had already picked up on things he hadn't. Each time they'd encountered one of the suspects, Max's reactions had shifted subtly, like he was catching whiffs of intentions that were hidden from Aiden's human senses. Aiden's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. A message from Captain Garcia. "New evidence found at the scene. I'll fill you in later. Stay out of trouble." Aiden stared at the message, 1,000 questions firing in his mind. What new evidence? Was it something that could point him in the right direction? Something that might reveal the real reason Lou had been killed? One thing was clear. Lou's death wasn't a simple case of bad luck or a crime of opportunity. Whoever had come to 317 had planned it, perhaps even waited for the right moment, and as Aiden looked down at Max, he realized they were no longer alone in this. Max's instincts, his reactions to the suspects, they were as much a part of the investigation as Aiden's hunches. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, but Aiden knew it was only the beginning. Chapter 4. beneath the surface. The morning air was crisp as Aiden stood outside the old building, watching as the city came to life around him. He knew he was edging closer to answers, but every lid seemed tangled with Lou's complicated past. The fragments he'd collected from Marta May and Sammy had only deepened his questions, and the message from Captain Garcia about new evidence at the crime scene lingered in his mind. What could they have found? Max sat at his side, his gaze steady and unblinking as if sensing the day's weight. Aiden gave the dog a reassuring pat, and together, they headed inside to begin their unofficial investigation in earnest. His first stop was Sammy's apartment, a cluttered space filled with guitars, worn-out sheet music, and remnants of late-night creative sessions. Sammy answered the door with dark circles under his eyes, looking wary but resigned. "Morning, Sammy," Aiden said, his voice calm but probing. "I wanted to ask you about that night. You mentioned seeing someone outside Lou's door." Sammy scratched his head, shifting from foot to foot. "Yeah. It was a few nights before, you know. The guy was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothes. He didn't stick around too long, but he definitely looked like he had business with Lou." "Anything else you remember?" Aiden asked, watching for any sign of evasion. Sammy hesitated, glancing around the room before his eyes landed on Max. "Look, man, Lou wasn't exactly a clean slate, if you get what I mean. People didn't just visit him for a friendly chat. I'd hear things, arguments, shady conversations. Lou was retired, but he still had connections." "Connections?" Aiden pressed. Sammy shrugged, his gaze darting toward the hallway as if expecting someone to overhear. "I don't know specifics, just that Lou had ties to people who like to keep their dealings quiet. I don't know what he was mixed up in, but I figured he could handle it. Guess I was wrong." Aiden nodded, processing this new perspective. It painted a different picture of Lou, one where his rival wasn't simply a retired detective enjoying the quiet life. Maybe Lou had been in over his head, even after leaving the force. As Aiden thanked Sammy and left, he noticed Max's behavior. The dog seemed to linger at Sammy's doorway, his ears pricked, as if there was something he hadn't yet understood. Aiden gave Max a quiet nudge, leading him back into the hallway and making his way to May's workplace. Wong's kitchen was bustling with the lunch crowd, the scent of noodles and dumplings filling the air. May saw Aiden enter and gestured him to a quieter corner. She looked uneasy, her eyes darting between him and the kitchen entrance, as if expecting someone to interrupt. "Detective Shaw," she whispered, casting a cautious glance around. "You really shouldn't be asking questions. Lou, he wasn't exactly careful about who he trusted." "Did he ever mention anything specific?" Aiden asked. "Any details about these connections?" She hesitated, wringing her hands. "I don't know specifics, but I do know he was in contact with a few people he shouldn't have been. They'd come here sometimes, order a drink and have quick chats. He was curious, I guess, always asking questions, trying to solve something on his own. I thought maybe he just missed the action, you know? Retirement can't be easy for people like him." Aiden's jaw tightened. This new angle on Lou made the mystery deeper. Had his old rival really been carrying out his own investigation? And if so, into what? "He ever say what he was working on?" Aiden asked. May shook her head, her expression wary. "No. But whatever it was, I don't think it was small time. I heard him mention someone from the old days a few times. People who were more ghost than man. That's when I started seeing that tall guy showing up outside his door." Aiden's stomach twisted. Lou had been a tough cop, but retirement was supposed to be his time to relax, not dig up old ghosts. Was he tracking someone he'd failed to catch? Or was there something darker, something personal? Max let out a low growl, pulling Aiden's attention. He looked down to find his dog watching May intently, as if searching for a hidden truth. Max's instincts were spot on, and Aiden felt a pang of gratitude for the silent cues the dog provided. Aiden thanked me and stepped out of the restaurant, his mind reeling with new possibilities. As he started back toward his apartment, he felt the familiar nagging of unfinished business. If Lou had been investigating something dangerous, it was possible that whatever he was onto had gotten him killed. As he neared his apartment, Henry, the landlord, was waiting by the entrance, his face twisted into a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation. "Aiden." Henry greeted him with a forced smile. "Been seeing you around a lot lately. Hope you're not looking too hard into things." "Just paying my respects, Henry," Aiden replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Seems like Lou kept a few secrets, though. You know anything about that?" Henry's expression flickered with something close to panic before he quickly masked it. "Lou was a private man. I didn't pry. He paid rent on time and didn't cause much trouble. Most of the time, anyway." "Most of the time?" Aiden echoed, watching him closely. Henry's hand went to the back of his neck, rubbing nervously. "Well, he'd have people coming and going, odd hours, strange folks. It was unsettling, but it's New York, you know. People don't question things too much." Aiden nodded, pretending to drop the subject, though he noted the glances Henry cast around the hallway, like he was afraid someone would overhear. It was clear Henry knew more than he was letting on, but he seemed too skittish to say anything directly. Maybe fear kept him in line. A fear of the same people Lou had tangled with. As Aiden made his way back to his apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that the building itself was hiding something. It wasn't just Lou's secrets. It was the way the neighbors avoided eye contact, the way the walls seemed to hold whispers. Back in his apartment, Aiden sat down with Max, sifting through everything he'd learned. His mind raced as he replayed May's words about the old days and Henry's obvious discomfort. Someone had a stake in keeping Lou's secrets buried. Max settled at his feet, his eyes keen and watchful. Aiden gave him a reassuring pat, knowing the dog sensed his tension. Max had never been one to shy from danger, and Aiden knew he could count on his partner's silent support as they unraveled the mystery together. Then, as he sipped his coffee, Aiden remembered Captain Garcia's message about new evidence. He pulled out his phone and dialed her number, half expecting her to ignore his call, given the boundaries she'd already set. To his surprise, she answered on the first ring. "Shaw, I told you I'd fill you in later." "I know, Cap, but you know I can't let this one go." "Was it something big?" he asked, cutting right to the chase. She sighed, clearly debating her answer. "We found an old notebook in Lou's apartment, tucked inside a vent. It's cryptic, full of names and numbers, half-finished sentences, but here's the thing, one name kept coming up, a name I think you might recognize." Aiden's pulse quickened. "Who?" "David Chen," Garcia replied. "Does it mean anything to you?" The name hit Aiden like a punch to the gut. David Chen had been a notorious figure back in Lou's early days, a drug lord who'd slipped through the cracks more times than Aiden could count. Lou had been obsessed with catching him, but Chen had always managed to evade the law. Rumor had it he'd vanished years ago, blending into the city's shadows. "Lou was after Chen," Aiden muttered, the puzzle pieces clicking into place. "It looks that way, but be careful, Shaw. Whoever killed Lou might still be watching," Garcia warned before ending the call. Aiden set down his phone, his mind churning. So, Lou had been chasing an old ghost, one who had every reason to want him dead. The picture was becoming clearer, and yet more dangerous by the second. Max nudged him, his eyes bright and alert as if ready for the challenge ahead. "Looks like we're onto something, boy," Aiden murmured, running a hand along Max's sturdy back. "Time to see if we can find where the shadows lead." With that, Aiden's determination set in. Lou's life and death was more than just a tragic end for an old detective. It was the start of a hunt for the truth, and Aiden would follow it, wherever it might lead. Chapter 5. Secrets of the Building. The quiet settled over the building like a heavy fog as Aiden moved through the dimly lit halls. The discovery of David Chen's name in Lou's hidden notebook had cracked open a dark path, one that stretched back to Lou's past cases, filled with ghosts Aiden was only beginning to see. He couldn't shake the feeling that answers were hiding somewhere within these walls. Max padded beside him, his ears alert, and his eyes scanning each shadow with practiced vigilance. The retired police dog's presence reminded Aiden of all the cases they'd tackled together. And while Lou might have been Aiden's old rival, Max's loyalty remained unshaken. It was as if the dog knew that finding Lou's killer was the only way to lay their mutual friend's spirit to rest. They started in the basement, a cold, cluttered space filled with storage lockers, abandoned furniture, and forgotten odds and ends. Aiden ran his flashlight over the walls, casting stark shadows across the peeling paint and dusty surfaces. He was looking for anything unusual: hidden panels, loose floorboards, a telltale hollow sound that would indicate something behind the walls. But the basement revealed nothing. Moving carefully, Aiden and Max made their way back upstairs. The building seemed to be holding its breath, the creaks and groans of old wood only adding to the tension. He found himself at the door of the storage room near the boiler on the first floor. This room was barely used save for maintenance, but it was exactly the kind of place Lou might have chosen to hide something. As Aiden opened the door, Max let out a low whine, his eyes fixed on a corner near the back of the room. Aiden moved toward it, noticing a faint discoloration on the wall, a subtle rectangle that didn't quite match the surrounding plaster. He tapped lightly, and a hollow echo confirmed his suspicions. With careful but firm pressure, he pried at the edge, feeling the panel give way until it popped open. Behind it was a hidden compartment, not large but big enough to hold something significant. His flashlight beam landed on a small bundle wrapped in cloth and tied with string. Beside it, an old dusty burner phone lay on top of a stack of yellowing papers. Aiden reached in and pulled out the items, setting them carefully on the floor. Max watched intently, his nose twitching, as Aiden unwrapped the bundle, revealing a set of photographs and a tightly folded piece of paper. The photographs were old, but not faded. Several black and white images of men standing in dimly lit rooms, exchanging what appeared to be documents and cash. In one of the photos, Aiden recognized Lou, looking far younger, almost brash, his gaze intense as he stood alongside a man who had to be David Chen. Aiden's pulse quickened. The photos weren't just relics of Lou's past, they were evidence. Lou had been tailing Chen, documenting his movements, gathering proof. But why keep these photos hidden here? Had Lou been forced to stash them at the last minute, or had he suspected that someone in the building was watching him? Aiden unfolded the piece of paper, and his breath caught. Scrawled in Lou's unmistakable handwriting was a list of names, each followed by a series of dates. Some of the names he recognized immediately. Several were former cops, now retired. Others were criminals he'd encountered over the years, people with ties to David Chen's network. But one name at the bottom of the list made him pause: Henry Caldwell. Henry, the building's landlord. Aiden's mind raced, piecing together the fragments. Lou must have suspected Henry was tied to Chen's operations, perhaps as a middleman, someone who kept tabs on Lou's investigation. That would explain Henry's nervous behavior and his insistence that Lou's death was inevitable. Just something that happens when people get involved in the wrong things. Max let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the hallway outside the storage room. Aiden's heart raced as he stashed the photos and papers back in the compartment, keeping the burner phone in his pocket. He gave Max a silent signal to stay quiet and crept to the door, listening intently. Someone was moving in the hallway, their footsteps slow and deliberate as if trying to avoid being heard. Aiden held his breath, watching Max's ears swivel, tracking the sounds with perfect focus. Whoever it was, they stopped right outside the door. The silence stretched painfully. The only sound Aiden could hear was his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Then, the footsteps retreated, fading down the hall until they were gone. Aiden exhaled, a knot of tension releasing from his chest. He knew now that his search hadn't gone unnoticed. Someone in this building was keeping an eye on him, just as they'd likely kept an eye on Lou. He returned to his apartment with Max at his side, closing the door carefully behind them. Once inside, he retrieved the burner phone and powered it on. The screen lit up, but it was locked with a passcode. Aiden felt a surge of frustration. Whatever secrets it held were tantalizingly close, yet just out of reach. He'd have to find a way to unlock it, or perhaps hand it over to Captain Garcia if he couldn't crack it himself. The next morning, Aiden headed back downstairs, the events of the night weighing heavily on his mind. As he entered the lobby, he found Henry waiting near the front door, talking animatedly with May. She looked uncomfortable, her gaze flitting toward Aiden as he approached. Henry stiffened when he noticed Aiden, his expression guarded. "Detective Shaw, didn't expect to see you up and about so early," he said, forcing a smile. "Just making my rounds," Aiden replied, watching Henry's reaction closely. "You keeping busy, Henry?" "Always," Henry replied, a hint of tension creeping into his voice. "With everything going on, it's important to keep an eye on things." "Like you kept an eye on Lou?" Aiden asked, keeping his tone casual but pointed. Henry's face paled, and he stammered for a moment before regaining his composure. I don't know what you mean." Aiden took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I think you know exactly what I mean, Henry. Lou was watching someone in this building, and I think he was getting too close. Care to explain?" Henry glanced around, his eyes darting to May, who quickly excused herself, slipping back into the restaurant. He swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "Look, Detective Lou. He was digging up old business or things he should have left alone. I warned him. Told him that his snooping would get him hurt, but he wouldn't listen." "Did Chen have you on Lou?" Aiden pressed, his voice low. "Or are you hiding something else?" Henry took a step back, a bead of sweat forming on his brow. "I don't know anything about Chen. But Lou? He was paranoid. He thought everyone was out to get him. Maybe he finally pushed the wrong person too far." Aiden's gaze bore into Henry, but he sensed that pushing further wouldn't get him anything useful. Henry's fear was genuine, but it felt more like fear of retaliation than guilt. Whether Henry was directly involved or just a pawn, Aiden couldn't be sure. Max let out a soft growl, drawing Henry's attention. The landlord took another step back, clearly unnerved by the dog's intense stare. As Henry turned and hurried down the hall, Aiden watched him go, a sense of urgency gnawing at him. There was more to this story, something just beneath the surface, but Henry wasn't going to give it up easily. Back in his apartment, Aiden reviewed the photos and notes he'd retrieved from the hidden compartment. Lou had been onto something big, something that had ties to Chen's old operations and people inside the force. As he sifted through the evidence, Max settled beside him, his eyes watchful, his presence a steady reminder of the loyalty Lou had once inspired. Aiden knew he was close to something, close to unraveling the final threads of Lou's investigation. Chapter 6: A Dangerous Encounter. The streets outside hummed with the sounds of Chinatown, a blend of sizzling woks, clattering dishes, and distant conversations. The air was heavy with the scent of exotic spices and savory meats, enticing passers-by to step inside one of the many bustling restaurants. Lanterns swayed gently in the breeze, casting a warm glow over the colorful storefronts and intricate architecture. It was a vibrant and lively scene, but inside the old building the air was thick with unease. Aiden could feel it as he made his way down the hallway that night, Max close at his side. After his confrontation with Henry that morning, he sensed he was inching toward the truth. But with every step forward, the danger surrounding Lou's case seemed to grow. Aiden had spent the day quietly piecing together the clues. The hidden photos of David Chen, the burner phone, and the list of names Lou had compiled painted a murky picture of unfinished business. Lou's investigation had been thorough, secretive, and deeply personal, and it was clear now that Lou's killer might still be lurking, someone intent on keeping these secrets buried. As night settled over the building, Aiden's thoughts were interrupted by the sharp ring of his phone. It was Captain Garcia. "Aiden, I know you've been looking into this, even though I told you to stay out," she began, her voice tense. "Cap? I couldn't just ignore it. Lou and Lou wasn't just another case," Aiden replied, his voice a mix of defiance and urgency. There was a pause, then a resigned sigh. "I get it. Just be careful. I don't know who's pulling the strings, but whoever they are, they're dangerous. And we're still working on unlocking the burner phone you found. If there's anything useful, you'll be the first to know." "Thanks, Cap," Aiden said, though he could hear the worry in her voice. After she hung up, he slipped his phone back into his pocket, his determination setting in. He couldn't stop now. Max let out a soft whine, his gaze fixed on the door. Aiden took a deep breath, grabbing his flashlight and giving Max a quick scratch behind the ears. They were headed to Lou's apartment one last time. He needed to make sure he hadn't missed anything. The hallway stretched out before them, shadowed and silent. Aiden's footsteps were muffled, and Max padded alongside him, moving with the cautious alertness only a retired police dog could muster. Aiden could feel the weight of the building around him like it was holding its breath. Just as he reached Lou's door, the creak of footsteps sounded from behind him. Aiden turned, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm, but he forced himself to relax when he saw Sammy, the musician, standing at the end of the hallway, his eyes wide and anxious. "Aiden," Sammy whispered, glancing around nervously. "Can we talk?" Aiden nodded, motioning for Sammy to step closer. "What is it?" I shouldn't be saying anything," Sammy stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I heard someone talking in the hall last night near Lou's door. It wasn't Henry or May, and it definitely wasn't Marta. It was a man. Deep voice. He sounded angry." Aiden's jaw clenched. Another unknown figure, lurking in the shadows. "Did you see him?" Sammy shook his head, looking around as if someone might be watching. "No, but he sounded dangerous, like he was warning someone." "Warning who?" Aiden asked, his pulse quickening. "Don't know, but I heard him say something about Lou. Like Lou had stuck his nose where it didn't belong. Like he'd been warned to back off." Aiden felt a chill crawl down his spine. Lou had clearly been digging too deeply, and this mysterious figure had tried to scare him off before things escalated. But Lou hadn't stopped, and now he was dead. Whoever this man was, he had to be connected to Chen's network. "Thanks, Sammy." "Sammy?" Aiden said, his voice grim. "If you know when you hear anything else, let me know. And keep your head down." Sammy nodded, throwing a nervous glance over his shoulder before disappearing down the hall. Aiden turned back to Lou's apartment, his mind racing. He pushed open the door, the familiar chill of the unlit room settling over him. Shadows clung to the corners, and the faint smell of stale cigarette smoke lingered, a reminder of Lou's habitual late-night smoking. Max stepped into the room first, his ears twitching as he scanned the space. Aiden followed, shining his flashlight over the walls, searching for any missed clues. His eyes fell on Lou's desk, where a stack of files and a small locked drawer had been left untouched by the initial police sweep. It was odd for Lou, who had always kept his things in order. Aiden knelt beside the desk, feeling along the edge until he found a small keyhole. Cursing under his breath, he pulled out his lock-picking kit. It took a moment of careful maneuvering, but eventually, the lock clicked open. Inside the drawer was a small, neatly folded map of Chinatown and a list of addresses, some of which Aiden recognized as known fronts for Chen's associates. Max let out a low growl, his head swiveling toward the door. Aiden froze, his instincts screaming as he registered the barely audible sound of footsteps just outside. They weren't Sammy's or Henry's light steps. These were heavier, deliberate, and closing in. Aiden's hand moved to his gun, his body tense as he signaled Max to stay silent. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. Aiden's pulse raced as he crouched behind the desk, listening to the faint creak of the door swinging open. He peered around the edge of the desk, catching a glimpse of a shadow, a tall, broad figure silhouetted in the doorway. The figure hesitated, scanning the room with sharp, predatory eyes. For a moment, the intruder's gaze landed on the desk where Aiden crouched, and Aiden held his breath, hoping the darkness would cloak him. But just as the man took a step forward, Max let out a fierce growl. Lunging forward with his teeth bared, the figure recoiled, startled, and Aiden seized the moment to spring up, his gun trained on the man. "Stop! NYPD!" Aiden barked, his voice echoing in the room. The man hesitated only a second before he bolted, slamming the door behind him. Aiden cursed, rushing to the hallway, in pursuit. He caught a glimpse of the man's back as he dashed down the stairs, his steps echoing off the walls. Aiden and Max charged down the stairs after him, but by the time they reached the ground floor, the man had already slipped out the back entrance and into the maze of Chinatown's narrow streets. "Damn it!" Aiden muttered, slowing to a stop as he scanned the empty alley, the shadows stretching long and dark in every direction. Max sniffed the air, his body tense and ready, but the man was gone. Whoever he was, he'd known the building's layout well enough to escape without a trace. Back in the apartment, Aiden locked the door, his mind churning. Whoever that man was, he was deeply connected to Lou's murder, and he wasn't afraid to go after anyone digging into it. The message was clear. Lou's death was a warning, and Aiden was now in the crosshairs. He took a deep breath, glancing down at Max, who watched him with steady eyes, his body still vibrating with tension. "Looks like we're not just chasing ghosts anymore, Max," he murmured. "Someone doesn't want us here." As he sat down at Lou's desk, the map and addresses still spread out before him, Aiden realized he'd crossed a line. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was personal. Lou had been investigating Chen's network, risking his life in the process, and now Aiden had picked up where he'd left off. He studied the addresses on the map, his mind racing with possibilities. Each location was a potential clue, a step closer to finding the truth about Lou's death. And somewhere in the shadows, the figure who had just slipped away was watching, waiting. For the first time, Aiden felt the full weight of what he was up against. He knew he couldn't do this alone. He'd need help, resources, and every ounce of his and Max's training to see this through. But no matter the cost, he would unravel the web Lou had left behind. The danger was real, and so was the threat, but Aiden was more determined than ever. Whoever had taken Lou's life had made one fatal mistake. They'd underestimated the loyalty of a detective and his dog, and with that thought anchoring him, Aiden knew that he and Max would follow the shadows, even if it led them to the very heart of Chinatown's underworld. Chapter 7. Closing in on the truth. Aiden stood in his dimly lit apartment, maps, notes, and photos of David Chen spread out across his table. The close encounter with the mysterious intruder had left him rattled, but it had also ignited a sharper edge of determination. He knew now that Lou's investigation had triggered a dormant network, one with far-reaching roots in Chinatown, and that he was dangerously close to discovering what Lou had died for. Max lay curled by his feet, his ears perked up, his gaze fixed on Aiden as if sensing his partner's determination. Aiden absently scratched the dog's head, grateful for Max's presence as he reviewed the leads they'd uncovered so far. The burner phone was still locked, but Lou's hidden stash of photos, the map, and the list of addresses had given Aiden a starting point. Each address Lou had marked led to places tied to David Chen's associates, fronts for businesses that had provided cover for Chen's criminal activities. Aiden knew it would be dangerous to visit them directly, but he was out of options. He had to follow the trail where it led, even if it meant walking into enemy territory. He was about to head out when his phone buzzed. A text from Captain Garcia flashed on the screen. "We unlocked the burner phone. Meet me at the precinct." Aiden grabbed his coat and called for Max, who immediately perked up, ready to follow him into whatever awaited. They moved quickly through the city, and soon Aiden was in Garcia's office, his gaze locked on the phone lying on her desk. Garcia looked at him with a weary expression. "You're lucky I'm sharing this with you, Shaw. This investigation's already on thin ice as it is." "I know," Aiden replied, glancing down at the unlocked burner phone. "What did you find?" Garcia tapped the screen, scrolling through the sparse call history and a few text messages. "It's mostly empty. Whoever used it was careful. But there are a few messages that stand out." She handed him the phone, and Aiden read right through the texts, his pulse quickening. The messages were cryptic, but they referenced clearing old debts, loose ends, and several mentions of the deal. One message in particular stood out, dated only a day before Lou's death. 317 is compromised, make sure it's handled. Aiden felt a cold wave wash over him. The message was clear. Lou's apartment had become a liability, and someone had decided he needed to be handled. He clenched his fists, the implications sinking in. Garcia watched him carefully. There's more. The last call Lou received was from an unknown number linked to a burner, likely Chen's network. It pinged near a location we know as a former meeting point for Chen's operations, an old tea house on Doyers Street. The signal went dead shortly after Lou was killed. Aiden's mind raced. Doyers Street, known locally as the Bloody Angle, had been a hotspot for gang activity in its time. If Chen's network was still active, it made sense that they'd be operating out of one of Chinatown's quieter, hidden spots. The tea house was a good place to start. But it wouldn't be easy. Chen's men would likely be watching the area. "Thanks, Cap," he said, tucking the burner phone into his pocket. "I'll be careful." "Make sure you are, Shaw. This goes deeper than you think," Garcia warned, her tone uncharacteristically somber. Whatever Lou was chasing, it was dangerous enough to get him killed. Don't make the same mistake. Aiden nodded, feeling the weight of her words as he left. He and Max made their way to Doyers Street, the familiar streets of Chinatown, shifting into quieter, narrower alleys. The night was heavy with a low fog that clung to the air, making the already winding streets feel like a maze of shadows. They reached the tea house, its windows dim and obscured by grime, the sign faded with age. Aiden knelt beside Max, giving him a command to stay low and alert. They moved carefully, circling the building to check for any signs of activity. As they neared the back entrance, Aiden heard hushed voices coming from inside, muffled by the walls but unmistakable. He crept closer, pressing his ear to the door. He could hear the voices speaking. He was getting too close. Chen warned us to keep an eye on 317, but Lou kept poking around. One voice muttered low and irritated. A second voice, deeper and more menacing, replied, "Chen doesn't tolerate mistakes. You know what happens to anyone who compromises the operation. Lou brought it on himself." Aiden's blood ran cold. Lou had been watching them, and in return, they'd been watching him. Lou's death wasn't just a warning, it was an execution, punishment for digging where he wasn't supposed to. Suddenly the voices went silent. Aiden pulled back from the door, motioning for Max to stay behind him. The door creaked open, and a tall figure stepped out, pausing as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. He was dressed in dark clothes, his face partially obscured by a hood. But Aiden recognized the broad-shouldered build from the man who'd broken into Lou's apartment. Aiden wasted no time. "NYPD, hands where I can see them." The man froze for a split second, then bolted, dashing down the narrow alley. Aiden gave chase, Max right at his heels, the dog's powerful strides keeping pace with Aiden as they pursued the figure through the winding streets. The man was fast, weaving through the alleys with a practiced agility, but Max was faster. The retired police dog surged ahead, cutting through the fog and closing the distance. Just as the man glanced back, Max lunged, catching hold of his jacket and pulling him to the ground with a fierce growl. Aiden reached them in seconds, gun trained on the man as he struggled beneath Max's weight. "You move and he'll make sure you regret it," Aiden warned. The man went still, his eyes darting between Aiden and the dog. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he hissed, his voice filled with venom. "Chen's network goes deeper than you think. Lou should have stayed out of it." "So you killed him to make sure he didn't?" Aiden pressed, his gaze unwavering. The man let out a dark chuckle. "You think it's that simple?" Lou wasn't innocent. He'd been on Chen's payroll years ago, but he got greedy, thought he could expose us and walk away clean. No one walks away from Chen. Aiden's stomach twisted. Lou on Chen's payroll? It didn't add up, but the man's words carried a dark truth, one that painted Lou's death in a new unsettling light. "Chen doesn't leave loose ends," the man continued, his voice low, "and neither do we." Before Aiden could react, the man twisted his wrist, producing a small knife he'd concealed in his sleeve. He lashed out, aiming at Max, but the dog was faster, dodging with a growl and biting down hard on the man's arm, forcing him to drop the knife. Aiden moved in, cuffing the man with swift precision, locking his arms behind his back. He patted him down, making sure there were no other weapons, then hauled him to his feet. "You're going to tell me everything," Aiden said, his voice cold. "Every detail about Lou's involvement, Chen's operations, and whatever plan you were trying to protect." The man sneered, but there was a glint of fear in his eyes. "You don't understand. It doesn't end with me. Chen's network runs deep. Cops, politicians, everyone's got a piece of his empire. Lou was part of it once, and he couldn't escape." Aiden's mind spun, the puzzle pieces falling into place with a terrible clarity. Lou hadn't just been investigating Chen. He'd been trying to sever the ties that had once bound him to the criminal underworld, perhaps hoping to make amends before it was too late. Max let out a low growl, his eyes never leaving the man. Aiden felt a grim satisfaction knowing that they'd finally caught a piece of Chen's network, even if the man was just a cog in a larger machine. "Then let's go see how deep those connections run," Aiden muttered, leading the man toward the precinct. As he walked, Aiden felt the weight of Lou's legacy press on him. His old rival had been trapped, torn between his own mistakes and his need to set things right. And now, with Max by his side, Aiden had become the bridge between Lou's past and the justice that was long overdue. The path ahead was murky and fraught with danger, but he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't stop until he'd uncovered every secret Lou had tried to bury. Chapter 8. The Final Revelation. The interrogation room was silent except for the low hum of the overhead lights. Aiden leaned forward across the metal table, his eyes locked on the man they'd chased down in Chinatown, a figure who moments before had seemed impenetrable. But now, under Aiden's intense gaze, the man appeared vulnerable and on edge. Aiden could see the beads of sweat forming on his brow, a telltale sign of his nerves. Without breaking eye contact, Aiden began to speak in a calm but firm tone, determined to get the answers they needed to solve the case. There was a flicker of fear in his gaze as he sat shackled, his wrist bandaged where Max had bitten him. Captain Garcia stood behind Aiden, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Max lay beside them, his gaze fixed on the suspect, ready to spring into action if needed. Aiden knew this was his last chance to get the answers Lou had died for. "Let's start with the basics," Aiden said, keeping his voice steady. "Your name, your role in Chen's network." The man's lip curled in defiance, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. "My name doesn't matter," he sneered, "and neither does my role. Chen's network stretches far beyond one man." "You don't get to play games with us," Garcia cut in, her tone steely. "Lou Miller is dead, and you were there when he was killed. That puts you on the hook for murder unless you start talking." Aiden watched as the man's defiance wavered, the truth edging closer. He'd seen this look before. The moment when suspects realized the walls were closing in. Finally, the man let out a resigned sigh, his voice lowering. "Lou was one of us once," he began, his words slow and bitter. "Years ago, he worked with Chen, used his badge to help keep Chen's operations under the radar. But after he retired, he changed. Got a conscience, maybe. Started digging around, trying to make up for his sins. Problem was, Chen didn't care for redemption." Aiden clenched his jaw. Lou, on Chen's payroll. It explained so much, the rivalry, Lou's secrets, his sudden obsession with certain cases even after retirement. But it also painted Lou in a new light, one that was painfully complex. Lou had been trying to right his wrongs, but in doing so he'd put a target on his back. "So, you killed him because he turned on Chen?" Aiden asked, his voice tight. The man shook his head. "I didn't kill him. I was only supposed to scare him off, make him back down. But Lou didn't take the hint. He'd found something that would bring down Chen's whole operation. I don't know what it was, but he hid it somewhere. Chen's orders were clear. Find Lou's evidence, whatever it took." Aiden exchanged a glance with Garcia. Lou's investigation had been more than a personal vendetta. It was an attempt to dismantle the very empire he'd once served. And now, somewhere in that building, Lou had hidden a final piece of evidence, the kind that could bring down a kingpin like David Chen. "Where were you supposed to look?" Garcia asked, her voice taut with urgency. The man's gaze dropped, his hands twitching in the cuffs. "His apartment, his car, anywhere he might have hidden it. We were running out of places when he was found. Chen doesn't forgive failure. If I don't find that evidence, I'm as good as dead." "Then you better start thinking of a way to stay useful," Aiden said, his tone laced with grim satisfaction. "Because if you know anything about where Lou might have hidden his evidence, now's the time to share." The man hesitated, then muttered, "Lou was always talking about the heart of the building. Something about the place he could always trust. He was paranoid, thought someone was watching him, even in his own home." The heart of the building. Aiden's mind raced. Lou had hidden the evidence somewhere that felt secure, somewhere with layers of protection, but also somewhere accessible only to him. Aiden knew the building well enough to know there was only one place that fit the description. The boiler room. Aiden whispered to Garcia, who nodded. They wasted no time. With the man secured under watch, Aiden and Garcia, along with Max, made their way back to the apartment building, moving through its familiar hallways with a renewed sense of purpose. The boiler room was dank and cold, filled with the low hum of machinery and the faint scent of rusted metal. Steam hissed from the pipes that lined the walls, adding to the eerie atmosphere of the room. The dim light cast long shadows that danced across the floor, making it difficult to see. Aiden ran his flashlight along the walls, looking for anything that seemed out of place, while Max sniffed the air, his senses on high alert. Finally, his beam landed on a small panel beside the boiler, one that looked as though it had been recently tampered with. Aiden pried it open, revealing a narrow compartment hidden behind the wall. Inside was a dusty envelope, thick with papers, and a small thumb drive. Aiden carefully pulled out the contents, opening the envelope to find detailed documents on Chen's network, names, dates, transaction records, and the web of connections that spanned the city. It was a treasure trove of evidence, the kind that could unravel Chen's empire from the inside out. But it was the thumb drive that made his heart race. Lou had taken a risk by storing this much information in one place. Whatever was on it, it had been enough to get him killed. Back at the precinct, they plugged the drive into a secure computer. Aiden, Garcia, and a tech specialist watched as files popped up on the screen, each one more damning than the last. Financial records linking Chen to prominent business leaders, politicians, even some high-ranking members of law enforcement. It was more than enough to bring down Chen and anyone who'd colluded with him. Aiden felt a surge of relief mixed with sadness. Lou had sacrificed everything to see this day come, to make amends for his past. And now, through his death, he'd found a way to take Chen down once and for all. Garcia looked at him, her eyes filled with a rare softness. "You did good, Shaw." Lou would have been proud. Aiden nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. Lou made his choices, but in the end, he did what he had to. He tried to make things right. As he stepped out into the precinct lobby, Max trotting loyally beside him, Aiden felt a quiet sense of closure. Lou's story had ended, but it had paved the way for justice, an ending Lou might have accepted even if he couldn't see it himself. Outside, the city was waking up, the first rays of dawn casting a soft glow over the streets of Chinatown. Aiden took a deep breath, the air crisp and cool. With Max at his side, he walked back toward the apartment building, feeling the echoes of Lou's presence with each step. The building was still, but its secrets had finally come to light. Lou's story was over, but Aiden knew he'd carry his old rival's memory with him, a reminder of the shadows they both had walked through, and the light they'd fought to find. As they approached the familiar steps, Max poked Aiden's knee, his eyes full of loyalty and understanding. Aiden gave him a grateful pat, sensing the strength of their bond. "Come on, Max," he murmured, "let's go home."